Introduction: The challenge of a life's time and a lifetime. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work, and that when we no longer know which way to go, we have begun our real journey. Wendell Berry. I don't know about you, but for myself, it feels like we are at a critical juncture of life on this planet. It could go any number of different ways. It seems that the world is on fire, and so are our hearts, inflamed with fear and uncertainty, lacking all conviction, and often filled with passionate but unwise intensity. How we manage to see ourselves in the world at this juncture will make a huge difference in the way things unfold. What emerges for us as individuals and as a society in future moments will be shaped in large measure by whether and how we make use of our innate and incomparable capacity for awareness in this moment. It will be shaped by what we choose to do to heal the underlying distress, dissatisfaction, and outright dis-ease of our lives and of our times, even as we nourish and protect all that is good and beautiful and healthy in ourselves and in the world. The challenge, as I see it, is one of coming to our senses, both individually and as a species. I think it's fair to say that there's a considerable movement in that direction worldwide, with little noticed and even less understood rivulets and streams of human creativity and goodness and caring, feeding into growing rivers of open-hearted wakefulness and compassion and wisdom, even in the face of the many challenges the world is facing. Where the adventure's taking us as a species, and in our individual private lives, even from one day to the next, is unknown. The destination of this collective journey we are caught up in is neither fixed nor predetermined, which is to say there is no destination, only the journey itself. What we are facing now and how we hold and understand this moment shapes what might emerge in the next moment, and the next, and shapes it in ways that are undetermined and, when all is said and done, undeterminable, mysterious. But one thing is certain. This is a journey that we are all on, everybody on the planet, whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, whether it's unfolding according to plan or not. Life is what it's about, and the challenge of living it as if it really mattered. Being human, we always have a choice in this regard. We can either be passively carried along by forces and habits that remain stubbornly unexamined and which imprison us in distorting dreams and potential nightmares, or we can engage in our lives by waking up to them and participating fully in their unfolding, whether we like what's happening in any moment or not. Only when we wake up do our lives become real and have even a chance of being liberated from our individual and collective delusions, diseases, and suffering. Years ago, a meditation teacher opened an interview with me on a 10-day, almost silent retreat by asking, "How's the world treating you?" I mumbled some response or other to the effect that things were going okay. Then he asked me, "And how are you treating the world?" I was quite taken aback. It was the last question I was expecting. It was clear he didn't mean in a general way. He wasn't making pleasant conversation. He meant right there on the retreat that day, in what may have seemed to me at the time like little, even trivial ways. I thought I was more or less leaving the world in going on this retreat, but his comment drove home to me that there is no leaving the world, and that how I was relating to it in any and every moment, even in this artificially simplified environment, was important. In fact, critical to my ultimate purpose in being there. I realized in that moment that I had a lot to learn about why I was even there in the first place, what meditation was really all about, and underlying it all, what I was really doing with my life. Over the years, I gradually came to see the obvious, that the two questions are actually different sides of the same coin. For we are in intimate relationship with the world in all our moments. The give and take of that relationality is continually shaping our lives. It also shapes and defines the very world in which we live and in which our experiences unfold. Much of the time, we see these two aspects of life, how the world is treating me and how I'm treating the world, as independent. Have you noticed how easily we can get caught up in thinking of ourselves as players on an inert stage as if the world were only out there and not also in here. Have you noticed that we often act as if there were a significant separation between out there and in here, when our experience tells us that it is the thinnest of membranes, really no separation at all? Even if we sense the intimate relationship between outer and inner, still we can be fairly insensitive to the ways our lives actually impinge upon and shape the world, and the ways in which the world shapes our lives, in a symbiotic dance of reciprocity and interdependence on every level, from intimacy with our own bodies and minds and what they are going through, to how we are relating to our family members, from our buying habits to what we think of the news we watch or don't watch on TV, to how we act or don't act within the larger world of the body politic. That insensitivity is particularly onerous, even destructive, when we attempt, as we often do, to force things to be a certain way, my way, without regard for the potential violence, even on the tiniest but still significant scale, that such a break in the rhythm of things carries with it. Sooner or later, such forcing denies the reciprocity, the beauty, and the give and take, and the complexity of the dance itself. We wind up stepping unwittingly or wittingly on a lot of toes. Such insensitivity, such out-of-touchness, isolates us from our own possibilities. In refusing to acknowledge how things actually are in any moment, perhaps because we don't want them to be that way, and in attempting to compel a situation or a relationship to be the way we want it to be out of fear that otherwise we may not get our needs met, we are forgetting that most of the time we hardly know what our own way really is. We only think we do. And we forget that this dance is one of extraordinary complexity as well as simplicity, and that new and interesting things happen when we do not collapse in the presence of our fears, and instead stop imposing and start living our truth, well beyond our limited ability to assert tight control over anything for very long. As individuals and as a species, we can no longer afford to ignore this fundamental characteristic of our reciprocity and interconnectedness, nor can we ignore how interesting new possibilities emerge out of our yearnings and our intentions when we are, each in our own way, actually true to them, however mysterious or opaque they may feel to us at times. Through our sciences, through our philosophies, our histories, and our spiritual traditions, we have come to see that our health and well-being as individuals, our happiness, and actually even the continuity of the germline, that life stream that we are only a momentary bubble in, that way in which we are the life givers and world builders of future generations, depends on how we choose to live our own lives while we have them to live. At the same time, as a culture, we've come to see that the very earth on which we live, to say nothing of the well-being of its creatures and its cultures, depends in huge measure on those same choices writ large through our collective behavior as social beings. To take just one example, which by now pretty much everybody knows about and honors with a few notable exceptions, global temperatures can be accurately charted back at least 400,000 years, and can be shown to fluctuate between extremes of hot and cold. We are in a relatively warm period, until recently not any warmer than any of the other warm eras Earth has experienced. In 2002, I was staggered to learn at a meeting between the Dalai Lama and a group of scientists that in the previous 44 years, atmospheric CO2 levels shot up by 18%, to a higher level than in the past 160,000 years, as measured by carbon dioxide in snow cores in Antarctica, and the level is continuing to rise at an ever-increasing rate. Now, 2015, 2016, and 2017 appear to be the warmest years on record. The dramatic and alarming recent increase in atmospheric CO2 is entirely due to the activity of human beings. If unchecked, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that levels of atmospheric CO2 will double by 2100, and as a result, the average global temperature may rise dramatically. One consequence, as we all know, is that there is already open water at the North Pole in summer, ice is melting at both poles, and glaciers worldwide are rapidly disappearing. The potential consequences in terms of triggering chaotic fluctuations destabilizing the climate worldwide, are sobering, if not terrifying. And we are seeing the results of that destabilization in the increasing severity of storms and their impact on our cities. While intrinsically unpredictable, the consequences include a possible dramatic rise in sea level in a relatively short period of time, and thus the flooding of all coastal habitations and cities worldwide. Imagine Manhattan if the ocean rises 50 feet. Think of Bangladesh, Puerto Rico, and all the coastal countries, cities, and islands where sea level rise and more severe weather are already being felt. We could say that these changes in temperature and weather patterns are one symptom, and only one among many, of a kind of autoimmune disease of the earth, in that one aspect of human activity is seriously undermining the overall dynamic balance of the body of the earth as a whole. Do we know? Do we care? Is it somebody else's problem? Their problem, whoever they are? Scientists, governments, politicians, utility companies, the auto industry? Is it possible, if we're really all part of one body, to collectively come to our senses on this issue and restore some kind of dynamical balance? Can we do that for any of the other ways in which our activity as a species threatens our very lives and the lives of generations to come, and in fact the lives of many other species as well? To my mind, it is past time for us to pay attention to what we already know or sense, not just in the outer world of our relationships with others and with our own surroundings, but in the interior world of our own thoughts and feelings, aspirations and fears, hopes and dreams. All of us, no matter who we are or where we live, have certain things in common. For the most part, we share the desire to live our lives in peace, to pursue our private yearnings and creative impulses, to contribute in meaningful ways to a larger purpose, to fit in and belong, and to be valued for who we are, to flourish as individuals and as families, and as societies of purpose and of mutual regard, to live in individual dynamic balance, which is health, and in a collective dynamic balance, what used to be called the common weal, which honors our differences and optimizes our mutual creativity and the possibility for a future free from wanton harm and from that which threatens what is most vital to our well-being and our very being. Such a collective dynamic balance, in my view, would feel a lot like heaven, or at least like being comfortably at home. It's what peace feels like when we really have peace and know peace inwardly and outwardly. It's what being healthy feels like. It's what genuine happiness feels like. It's like being at home in the deepest of ways. Isn't that somehow what we're all claiming we really want? Ironically, such balance is already here at our fingertips, at all times, in little ways that are not so little and have nothing to do with wishful thinking, rigid or authoritarian control, or utopias. Such balance is already here when we tune into our own bodies and minds, and to those forces that move us forward through the day and through the years, namely our motivation and our vision of what is worth living for and what needs undertaking. It is here in the small acts of kindness that happen between strangers and in families, and even in times of war between supposed enemies. It is here every time we recycle our bottles and newspapers, or think to conserve water, or act with others to care for our neighborhood, or protect our dwindling wilderness areas and other species with whom we share this planet. If we are suffering from an autoimmune disease of our very planet, and if the cause of that autoimmune disease stems from the activity and the mind states of human beings, then we might do well to consider what we might learn from the leading edge of modern medicine about the most effective approaches to such conditions. It turns out that in the past 40 years, medicine has come to know, from a remarkable blossoming of research and clinical practices in the field variously known as mind-body medicine, behavioral medicine, psychosomatic medicine, and integrative medicine, that the mysterious dynamic balance we call health involves both the body and the mind, to use our awkward and artificial way of speaking that bizarrely splits them from each other, and can be enhanced by specific qualities of attention that can be sustaining, restorative, and healing. It turns out that we all have, lying deep within us, in our hearts and in our very bones, a capacity for a dynamic, vital, sustaining inner peacefulness and well-being, and for a huge, innate, multifaceted intelligence that goes way beyond the merely conceptual. When we mobilize and refine that capacity and put it to use, we are much healthier physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and much happier. Even our thinking becomes clearer, and we are less plagued by storms in the mind. This capacity for paying attention and for intelligent action can be cultivated, nurtured, and refined beyond our wildest dreams if we have the motivation to do so. Sadly, as individuals, that motivation often comes only when we have already experienced the life-threatening disease or a severe shock to the system that may leave us in tremendous pain in both soma and psyche. It may only come, as it does for so many of our patients taking the MBSR program in the stress reduction clinic, once we are rudely awakened to the fact that no matter how remarkable our technological medicine, it has gross limitations that make complete cures a rarity, treatment often merely a rearguard action to maintain the status quo if there is any effective treatment at all, and even diagnosis of what is wrong an inexact and too often woefully inadequate science. Without exaggeration, it is fair to say that new developments in medicine, neuroscience, and epigenetics, as noted in the foreword, are showing that it is possible for individuals to mobilize deep, innate resources we all seem to share by virtue of being human, resources for learning, for growing, for healing, and for transformation that are available to us across the entire lifespan. These capacities are folded into our chromosomes, our genes, and our genome, our brains, our bodies, our minds, and into our relationships with each other and with the world. We gain access to them starting from wherever we are, which is always here, and in the only moment we ever have, which is always now. We all have the potential for healing and transformation, no matter what the situation we find ourselves in, of long duration or recently appearing, whether we see it as good, bad, or ugly, hopeless or hopeful, whether we see the causes as internal or external. These inner resources are our birthright. They are available to us across our entire lifespan because they are not in any way separate from us. It is in our very nature as a species to learn and grow and heal and move towards greater wisdom in our ways of seeing and in our actions, and towards greater compassion for ourselves and others. But still, these capacities need to be uncovered, developed, and put to use. Doing this is the challenge of our life's time, that is, a chance to make the most of the moments that we have. As a rule, our moments are easily missed or filled up with stuff, wanted and unwanted. But it is equally easy to realize that, in the unfolding of our lives, we actually have nothing but moments in which to live, and it is a gift to actually be present for them, and that interesting things start to happen when we are. This challenge of a life's time to choose to cultivate these capacities for learning, growing, healing, and transformation right in the midst of our moments is also the adventure of a lifetime. It begins a journey towards realizing who we really are and living our lives as if they really mattered. And they do, more than we think, more than we can possibly think, and not merely for our own enjoyment or accomplishment, although our own joy and feelings of well-being and accomplishment are bound to blossom all the same. This journey towards greater health and sanity is catalyzed by mobilizing and developing resources we all already have. And the most important one is our capacity for paying attention, in particular to those aspects of our lives that we have not been according very much attention to, that we might say we've been ignoring, seemingly forever. Paying attention refines and nurtures intimacy with awareness, that feature of our being that, along with language, distinguishes the potential of our species for learning and for transformation, both individual and collective. We grow and change and learn and become aware through the direct apprehending of things through our five senses, coupled with our powers of mind, which Buddhists see as a sense in its own right. We are capable of perceiving that any one aspect of experience exists within an infinite web of interrelationships, some of which are critically important to our immediate or long-term well-being. True, we might not see many of those relationships right away. They may, for now, be more or less hidden dimensions within the fabric of our lives, yet to be discovered. Even so, these hidden dimensions, or what we might call new degrees of freedom, are potentially available to us and will gradually reveal themselves to us as we continue to cultivate and dwell in our capacity for conscious awareness by attending intentionally with both awe and tenderness to the staggeringly complex yet fundamentally ordered universe, world, nation, geography, social terrain, family, mind, and body within which we locate and orient ourselves, all of which at every level is continually fluxing and changing, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, and thereby providing us with countless unexpected challenges and opportunities to wake up and see more clearly, and thus to grow and to move towards greater wisdom in our actions and towards quelling the tortured suffering of our tumultuous minds, habitually so far from home, so far from quiet and rest. This journey towards health and sanity is nothing less than an invitation to wake up to the fullness of our lives while we actually have them to live, rather than only, if ever, on our deathbeds, which Henry David Thoreau warned against so eloquently in Walden when he wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Dying without actually fully living, without waking up to our lives while we have the chance, is an ongoing and significant risk for all of us, given the automaticity of our habits and the relentless pace at which events unfold in this era, far greater than in his, and the mindlessness that tends to pervade our relationships to what may be most important for us, but at the same time least apparent in our lives. But as Thoreau himself counseled, it is possible for us to learn to ground ourselves in our inborn capacity for wise and open-hearted attention. He pointed out that it is both possible and highly desirable to first taste and then inhabit a vast and spacious awareness of both heart and mind. When properly cultivated, such awareness can discern, embrace, transcend, and free us from the veils and limitations of our routinized thought patterns, our routinized senses, and routinized relationships, and from the frequently turbulent and destructive mind states and emotions that accompany them. Such habits are invariably conditioned by the past, not only through our genetic inheritance, but through our experiences of trauma, fear, lack of trust and safety, feelings of unworthiness from not having been seen or honored for who we were, or from long-standing resentment for past slights, injustices, or outright and overwhelming harm. Nevertheless, they are habits that narrow our view, distort our understanding, and if unattended, prevent our growing and our healing. To come to our senses, both literally and metaphorically, on the big scale as a species and on the smaller scale as a single human being, we first need to return to the body, the locus within which the biological senses and what we call the mind arise. The body is a place we mostly ignore. We may barely inhabit it at all, never mind attending to it and honoring it. Our own body is strangely a landscape that is simultaneously both familiar and remarkably unfamiliar to us. It is a domain we might at times fear or even loathe, depending on our past and what we have faced or fear we might. At other times, it may be something we are wholly seduced by, obsessed with the body's size, its shape, its weight, or look, at risk for falling into unconscious but seemingly endless self-preoccupation and narcissism. At the level of the individual person, we know from many studies in the field of mind-body medicine for the past 40 years that it is possible to come to some degree of peace within the body and mind, and so find greater health, well-being, happiness, and clarity, even in the midst of great challenges and difficulties. Many thousands of people have already embarked on this journey through MBSR and have reported and continue to report remarkable benefits for themselves and for others with whom they share their lives and work. We have come to see that paying attention in such a way, and thereby tapping into those hidden dimensions and new degrees of freedom, is not a path for the select few. Anybody can embark on such a path and find great benefit and comfort in it. Coming to our senses is the work of no time at all, only of being present and awake here and now. It's also, paradoxically, a lifetime's engagement. You can say we take it on for life, in every sense of that phrase. The first step on the adventure involved in coming to our senses on any and every level is the cultivation of intimacy with awareness itself. Mindfulness is synonymous with awareness. My operational definition of mindfulness is that it is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. If you need a reason for doing so, we could add, in the service of wisdom, self-understanding, and recognizing our intrinsic interconnectedness with others and with the world, and thus also in the service of kindness and compassion. Mindfulness is intrinsically ethical when one understands what non-judgmental really means. It certainly doesn't mean that you won't have judgments. You will have plenty of those. It is an invitation to suspend the judging as best you can and simply recognize when it arises and not judge the judging. Our capacity for awareness and for self-knowing could be said to be the final common pathway of what makes us human. We gain access to the power and wisdom of our own capacity for awareness through cultivating mindfulness. And mindfulness can be cultivated, developed, and refined carefully and systematically as a practice, as a way of being through mindfulness meditation. The practice of mindfulness has been spreading rapidly around the world and into the mainstream of Western culture over the past 40 years, thanks in large measure to an ever-increasing number of scientific and medical studies of its various effects, and a consequent explosion of interest in many different domains, including K through 12 education, higher education, business, sports, criminal justice, the military, government, to say nothing of psychology and psychotherapy. There's nothing weird or out of the ordinary about meditating or meditation. It boils down to simply paying attention in your life as if it really, really mattered, because it does, and more than you think. It might also help to keep in mind that while it really is nothing out of the ordinary, nothing particularly special, mindfulness is at the same time extraordinarily special and utterly transformative in ways that are impossible to imagine, although that won't stop us from trying. When cultivated and refined, mindfulness can function to beneficial effect on virtually every level of human experience, from the individual to the corporate, the societal, the political, and the global. But it does require that we be motivated to realize who we actually are and to live our lives as if they really mattered, not just for ourselves, but for others and for the world. And that is because when we wake up, we realize that reality itself, and thus the world we inhabit, is characterized by deep interconnectedness. Nothing is really separate from anything else. And this interconnectedness becomes apparent the more we practice being awake and aware. This adventure of a lifetime unfolds from wherever we take our first step. When we walk this path, as we will do together in this book and the other 3 volumes, we find that we are hardly alone in our efforts, nor are we alone or unique even in our life difficulties. For in taking up the practice of mindfulness, you are participating in what amounts to an ever more robust global community of intentionality and exploration, one that ultimately includes all of us. One more thing before we embark. However much work we do on ourselves to learn and grow and heal what needs healing through the cultivation of mindfulness, it is not possible to be entirely healthy in a world that is profoundly unhealthy in some ways, and where it is apparent how much suffering and anguish there is in the world, both for those near and dear to us and also for those unknown to us, whether around the corner or around the world. Being in reciprocal relationship to everything makes the suffering of others our suffering, whether or not we sometimes turn away from it because it's so painful to bear. Rather than being a problem, however, other people's suffering can be a strong motivating factor for both inner and outer transformation in ourselves and in the world. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the world itself is suffering from a serious and progressive disease. A look back at history anywhere and at any time or just being alive now plainly reveals that our world is subject to convulsive spasms of madness, periods of what look like collective insanity, the ascendancy of narrow-mindedness and fundamentalism, times in which greater misery and confusion and centrifugal forces pervade the status quo. These eruptions are the opposite of wisdom and balance. They tend to be compounded by a parochial arrogance, usually devoted to self-aggrandizement and frank exploitation of others, inevitably associated with agendas of ideological, political, cultural, religious, or corporate hegemony, even as they are couched in language of humanism, economic development, globalism, and the all-seductive lure of narrowly conceived views of material progress and Western-style democracy. These forces often carry the hidden expense of cultural and environmental homogenization and degradation, and the gross abrogation of human rights, all of which feel like they add up to an outright disease. The pendulum swings seem to be coming faster and faster, so there is little time we can actually point to when we are in between such convulsive spasms and actually feeling at ease and benefiting from a pervading peacefulness. We know that the 20th century saw more organized killing in the name of peace and tranquility and the end of war than all centuries past combined, the vast majority of it erupting, ironically perhaps, in the great centers of learning and magnificent culture that are Europe and the Far East. And the 21st century is following on apace, if in a different but equally, if not more disturbing mode. Whoever the protagonists and whatever the rhetoric and the particular issues of contention, wars, including covert wars and wars against terror, are always put forth in the name of the highest and most compelling of purposes and principles by all sides. They always lead to murderous bloodletting that in the end, even when apparently unavoidable, harms both victims and perpetrators. And they are always caused by disturbances in the human mind. Engaging in harming others to resolve disputes that could be better resolved in other more imaginative ways also blinds us to the ways in which war and violence are themselves symptoms of the autoimmune disease from which our species seems to uniquely and collectively suffer. It blinds us as well to other ways available to us to restore harmony and balance when they are disrupted by very real, very dangerous, even virulent forces that we may unwittingly be helping to feed and expand, even as we abhor them and violently resist and combat them. What is more, winning a war nowadays is a far different challenge than winning the peace in a war's aftermath, as America has had to face up to in Iraq and Afghanistan. For that, an entirely different order of thinking and awareness and planning is required, one that can only come from understanding ourselves better and coming to a more gracious understanding of others who may not aspire to what we hold to be most important, who have their own culture and customs and values, and who may, hard as it is for us to sometimes believe, perceive the same events quite differently from how we might be perceiving them. The United States actually accomplished this in a remarkably prescient manner through the compassionate genius and wisdom of the Marshall Plan in Europe after the Second World War. All the same, we need continually to recognize the relativity of perception and the motivations that may both shape and derive from those perceptions, caught in restrictive loops that prevent a greater, more inclusive, and perhaps more accurate seeing. Given the conditions of the world, perhaps it is time for all of us to tap into a deeper dimension of human intelligence and commonality that underlies our different ways of seeing and knowing. This suggests that it may be profoundly unwise to focus solely on our own individual well-being and security, because our well-being and security are intimately interconnected with everything else in this ever-contracting world we inhabit. Coming to our senses involves cultivating an overarching awareness of all our senses, including our own minds and their limitations, including the temptation when we feel deeply insecure and have a lot of resources to try to control as rigidly and as tightly as possible all variables in the external world, an impossible and ultimately depleting, intrinsically violent, and self-exhausting enterprise. In the larger domain of the world's health, as in the case of our own life, because it's so basic, we will need to give primacy to awareness of the body, but in this case it is the body politic, the body constituted of communities and corporations, the very word means body, of nations and families, all of which have their own corresponding ills, diseases, and mix of views, as well as profound resources for cultivating self-awareness and healing within their own traditions and cultures. And beyond them, in the confluence of many different cultures and traditions, one of the hallmarks of today's world. An autoimmune disease is really the body's own self-sensing surveillance and security system, the immune system gone amok, attacking its own cells and tissues, attacking itself. No body and no body politic can thrive for long under such conditions, with one part of itself warring on another, no matter how healthy and vibrant it may be in other ways. Nor can any country thrive for long in the world with a foreign policy defined to a large extent by allergic reaction, one manifestation of a dysregulated immune system, nor on the excuse, true as it may be, that we are collectively suffering from severe post-traumatic stress following the September 11, 2001 attacks. That was only compounded by the arising of ISIS and of global terrorism. The ascendancy of currents of toxic and racist populism was not far behind. Such conditions only make it easier for either well-meaning or cynical leaders to exploit events for purposes that have little or nothing to do with healing or with true security or authentic democracy for that matter. As with an individual who is catapulted, however rudely and unexpectedly, onto the road to greater health and well-being by a non-lethal heart attack or some other untoward or unexpected diagnosis, a shock to the system, horrific as it may be, can, if held and understood with care and attention, be the occasion of a wake-up call to mobilize the deep and powerful resources that are at our disposal for healing and for redirecting our energies and priorities, resources that we may have too long neglected or even forgotten we possess, even as we respond mindfully and forcefully to ensure our safety and well-being. Such healing of the greater world is the work of many generations. It has already begun in many places as we realize the enormity of the risks we face by not paying attention to the moribund condition of the patient, which is the world, by not paying attention to the history of the patient, which is life on the planet, and in particular human life, since its activities are now shaping the destiny of all beings on Earth for lifetimes to come, by not paying attention to the autoimmune diagnosis that is staring us in the face, but which we are finding it increasingly difficult to accept, and by not paying attention to the potential for treatment that involves a widespread embracing of what is deepest and best in our own nature as living and therefore sensing beings while there's still time to do so. Healing our world will involve learning, however tentatively, to put our multiple intelligences to work in the service of life, liberty, and the pursuit of real happiness for ourselves and for generations of beings to come. Not just for Americans and Westerners either, but for all inhabitants of this planet, whatever continent or island we reside on, and not just for human beings, but for all beings in the natural, more than human world, what Buddhists often refer to as sentient beings. For sentience, when all is said and done, is the key to coming to our senses and waking up to the possible. Without awareness, without learning how to use, refine, and inhabit our consciousness, our genetic capacity for clear seeing and selfless action, both within ourselves as individuals and within our institutions, including businesses, the House and the Senate, the White House, seats of government, and larger gatherings of nations such as the United Nations and the European Union, we are dooming ourselves to the autoimmune disease of our own unawareness, from which stem endless rounds of illusion, delusion, greed, fear, cruelty, self-deception, and ultimately wanton destruction and death. It is humankind, the human species itself, that is the autoimmune disease of planet Earth. We are the disease agent and also its first victim. But that is not the end of the story by any means, at least not yet, not now. For as long as we are breathing, there is still time to choose life, to reflect on what such a choice is asking of us. This choice is a nitty-gritty, moment-to-moment one, not some colossal or intimidating abstraction. It is very close to the substance and substrate of our lives unfolding in whatever ways they do, inwardly in our thoughts and feelings, and outwardly in our words and deeds, moment by moment by moment. The world needs all its flowers just as they are, and even though they bloom for only the briefest of moments, which we call a lifetime. It is our job to find out one by one and collectively what kind of flowers we are, and to share our unique beauty with the world in the precious time that we have, and to leave our children and grandchildren a legacy of wisdom and compassion embodied in the way we live, in our institutions, and in our honoring of our interconnectedness at home and around the world. Why not risk standing firmly for sanity in our lives and in the world? The inner and the outer, a reflection of each other and of our genius as a species. The creative and imaginative efforts and actions of every one of us count, and nothing less than the health of the world hangs in the balance. We could say that the world is literally and metaphorically dying for us as a species to come to our senses, and now is the time. Now is the time for us to wake up to the fullness of our beauty, to get on with and amplify the work of healing ourselves, our societies, and the planet, building on everything worthy that has come before and that is flowering now. No intention is too small and no effort insignificant. Every step along the way counts, and as you will see, every single one of us counts. As described in the foreword, this book is now the first of 4 volumes, each with a part 1 and a part 2. Throughout all 4 books, I have woven here and there stories of my own personal experience. This is with the aim of giving you, the listener, a feeling sense of the paradox of how personal and particular meditation practice is on the one hand, and at the same time how impersonal and universal it is on the other, beyond any self-involved storyline of my experience, my life, that the mind's persistent selfing habit may cook up. A feeling sense of how important it is to take one's experience seriously but not personally, and with a healthy dose of lightheartedness and humor, especially in the face of the colossal suffering we are immersed in by virtue of being human, and in light of the ultimate evanescence of those distorting lenses called our opinions and our views that we so often cling to in trying desperately to make sense of the world and of ourselves. In part 1 of this volume, we will explore what meditation is and isn't, and what is involved in the cultivation of mindfulness. Part 2 examines the root sources of our suffering and dis-ease, and how paying attention on purpose and non-judgmentally is itself liberating, how mindfulness has been integrated into medicine, and how it reveals new dimensions of our minds and hearts that can be profoundly restorative and transforming. In Book 2, Falling Awake, Part 1 explores the sensescapes of our lives and how greater awareness of the senses feeds our well-being and enriches our lives and our ways of knowing and being in the world and within our own interiority. Part 2 gives the reader detailed instructions for the cultivating of mindfulness through the various senses, making use of a range of formal meditation practices, and thus gives a taste of their exquisite richness available to us in every moment. In Book 3, The Healing Power of Mindfulness, Part 1 explores how the cultivation of mindfulness can lead to healing and to greater happiness through what I call an orthogonal rotation in consciousness, in the ways we apprehend and then act in the world. Part 2 expands on the cultivation of mindfulness and gives a range of examples of how it can affect various aspects of our daily lives, everything from experiencing the place you are in, to watching or not watching the Super Bowl, to dying before we die. In Book 4, Mindfulness for All, Part 1 looks at the world of politics and the stress of the world from the perspective of mind-body medicine, and suggests some ways in which mindfulness may help transform and further the health of the body politic and of the world. Part 2 frames our lives and the challenges facing us in the present moment in the greater context and perspective of the species itself and of our evolution on the planet, and reveals the hidden dimensions of the possible that allow us to live our lives from moment to moment and from day to day as if they really mattered. As noted earlier, there is a progression through the 4 volumes from the what and the why of